Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And on behalf of AmCham Kuwait, I would like to warmly give you a welcome to the second session of our webinar series on human mobility, labor rights, and crisis considerations. So today's session is organized in collaboration with the International Organization for Migration, which is the IOM, also in partnership with Canadians in Kuwait and the Indian Business and Professional Council of Kuwait. We're very grateful for your partnership and shared commitment to supporting the private sector through knowledge sharing and dialogue. As employers and business leaders, we all recognize that our workforce is one of our greatest assets. Recent regional developments, as we may know, have reminded us of the importance of being prepared to protect employees, ensuring business continuity, and responding responsibly during times of uncertainty. So today's discussion will explore practical considerations surrounding migrant workers, labor rights, ethical recruitment, and the role of business and how it plays in the safeguarding the workforce before, during, and after the crisis. These are not only important human rights considerations, but also essential components of sound risk management and responsible business practices. At AmCham Kuwait, we remain committed to equipping our members with practical knowledge and timely insights that help organizations navigate evolving challenges while fostering resilient and responsible business. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope that you find this session valuable. We also encourage you to participate actively during the Q&A. We'll leave it for the end so that we can have a very smooth flow while our speakers present. And with that, it is my pleasure to hand it over to Tanya. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, colleagues. This is our second session. I'm very happy to be back and to deliver the first part of this presentation to you. I will be joined later again by my colleague Winnie, who is going to talk to you more specifically on protection of migrant workers in the crisis context, which unfortunately seems to have reached the stage of protraction. Sort of calmed down a bit. Now it's flaring up again. So it is definitely not over yet. So we still should also talk about what to do in this particular context. And that's also how I want to start. So if you could please move to the next slide. We will, in that sense, I will start by first of all giving you a little bit the latest updates on what we have seen through our collaboration with the missions on the ground, but also through migrant organizations that are on the ground, manpower included as a recruitment agency, what we have seen, what are, let's say, from April to June, what has emerged as a trend, more or less, in the last 3 months. So next slide, please. We will start by looking at some of the issues that you are probably all currently dealing with. And you can speak even more to those issues and probably provide examples. And actually, I would also encourage you to, let's keep this more interactive. If something that I'm saying and putting on the slide is actually speaking to you and you would like to come in and maybe give an example or comment on this, please feel free to do so. I don't think that we are a manageable crowd. So please feel free to come in. That would actually, very much enrich this exchange. So what we have seen in the last couple of months is basically that there is an increasing risk in terms of access to safe housing. Simply because people at this point are not able anymore to pay the rent for their accommodation. And that has a lot to do with the fact that whereas in April we have seen that people have been asked to take leave from work. Once they came back from leave, we have seen that now they are basically more asked to reduce their working hours. And that means reduced income, reduced salaries. And so it is an increasing issue to have access to safe housing and basic services. We still have, as you all know much better than we do here sitting in Cairo, physical safety. Because there is again attacks in Kuwait especially and also in Bahrain, which has also a lot of impact on mental health and psychosocial risks. We see mobility restrictions in the sense that people are not really well, I wouldn't say that there are actual restrictions in the sense that people cannot move, but they are indirect restrictions because people simply don't feel safe to move. So that has a lot to do with the fact that not only we have seen reduction in working hours, but we have also seen concurrently that the amount of time it takes to obtain renew visa has gone up like from 18 days to 80 days. And so people are very reluctant to consider to leave the country because they can simply not be sure that they will come back or when they will come back. So I would say maybe not mobility restrictions, but mobility disruptions. We have also seen that a number of people by now, because they didn't leave the country, there are increasing number of people that become irregular because they are basically overstaying and they would still rather stay in the GCC and try to take up jobs in the informal sector without work contracts. And that, of course, increases all the other risks of labor exploitation and other risks that you can think of when people are basically in an irregular status and they have to adopt or accept pretty much anything that is being offered to them in terms of jobs, in terms of what they are being paid for these jobs. If you become an irregular migrant worker, you can then also imagine that also access to consular assistance or access to justice is basically reduced to basically maybe emergency assistance simply because of your status. So those are, I would say, some risks that we have seen that have increased over the past 3 months. Next slide, please. So from that point of view, I think, talked a little bit about some of those issues, but when it comes to return, repatriation, reintegration, our offices working on the, let's say, receiving side in the countries of origin in Asia, they see, of course, the impact of those reduced wages and reduced salaries because of reduced working hours, because there is less money being sent back home. And that has quite a few effects on the families of those workers back home, especially when those families still have to repay debts that have been taken in order to make the move to the Gulf countries. So now, with less money coming from the Gulf, there is more pressure on the families to try to repay those debts. And at the same time, the countries of origin at the macro level, they also see, because of the delay, the time it takes now to actually get visa, that there is a lot less people leaving for the Gulf to take up jobs in the Gulf. That, and also the fact that a number of countries have introduced in this latest period, like from April until June, they have introduced more, or they have put more jobs on the list that will only be available for nationals. And that also reduces the number of people that can obtain a work visa with all the time and the delays that it takes currently to even come to the GCC. because increasingly jobs in retail and other sectors are now reserved for GCC nationals only. So that also means that there is a lot less people to move and to migrate to begin with. So that's also a trend that we have seen in the past couple of months. Now, next slide, please, and maybe also the one after that. When we look at the risks areas for migrant workers in general, independent now from the current crisis that we are witnessing, just because they are migrant workers, they face a number of obstacles in the migration process. And that starts with language barriers, cultural barriers, because you have to imagine that many migrant workers, not only from Asia, but increasingly also coming from the African continent, they are coming mostly from villages. And in the rural areas, you can imagine that people don't really have much exposure, let alone access to language training. And they have very little knowledge of how the world looks like outside of their surroundings, outside of their village. So if there is no pre-departure orientation that actually goes to those communities in those villages and provides people with information pre-employment on what the options are when you think about migrating to take up jobs in the Gulf, then people have very, very little ideas of what is awaiting them once they leave the airplane and they arrive at the airport in Kuwait or in Saudi Arabia or in Qatar. The fact that they leave their community and their family behind, where they had their support networks, is also rendering them more vulnerable, because before they build a new network in the country of destination among peer workers, for example, or let's say if they are in jobs which allow them to do so, to, for example, come together with their community church or in the mosques, it will take some time before they can actually set up their own network in the new environment where they arrive. Often they are faced with discrimination, and until they build such support networks with social isolation, discrimination when it comes to housing, discrimination when it comes to health services, discrimination just about everywhere where they go, right? Because they have been assigned certain roles in society, and so there is very actually discrimination. Not only we see that migrant workers often arrive in the country of destination without knowing much about the country where they arrive, the culture, the religion, what is socially acceptable, what is, what are the don'ts. They often also don't know about their legal rights and their protections and where they can turn to get support, whether it's legal support or health support, health counseling as well. And usually, until now, that is still very much the norm. They arrive with work permits that are tying them to specific employers. I think you have all seen in the past 3-4 years how that is changing dramatically from what I have seen when I first arrived 6 years ago here in this region. And I think that is definitely the trend, that like in other countries, we are basically moving away from these employer-tied work permits and more towards work contracts that contracts in that sense that you can also cancel these contracts and change employers. So there is a lot more mobility. But previously, and to the extent where those reforms, because it's also not a applicable for all sectors, where those work permits are tying in the migrants still to the employer. That, of course, also makes them more vulnerable because they don't have that liberty simply to leave the workplace if there is labor exploitation or, God forbid, even, forced labor or other types of abuses. People, migrant workers who do depend that much on their employer as the sponsor, as the garant to get the work permit, are obviously also fearful to be deported in case that they would leave the employer. So one thing is very much tied to the other, right? And vulnerability is also given by the fact that normally, and we will talk a little bit more about that a few slides later, there is also not a very open access to remedy, to justice, to grievance mechanisms. And that is something where actually the private sector can play a main role to try to address this lack of access to justice. And lastly, the vulnerability is also characterized by the migration costs, which for the time being, most often the migrants have to bear. And that is what incurs these debts that I have been talking about. If someone from a village, from a small rural community decides to migrate and leave the family behind, very often we hear that it's not only that the person had to take a decision with his or her family to sell land or the house in order to pay for the migration costs, but sometimes it also happens that the entire village is sort of contributing to this migration project. And that means that the person is in debt to the family, to the village, because they have all put money together to allow that one person from the community to make this migration. So that pressure is also making people very cautious to put anything in risk that could to do anything that could risk basically this migration project, and leads to the fact that they would adapt a lot of unpleasant working conditions just to be able to keep the job, to earn what they have been promised that they would earn, so that they can continue to pay money back and send money back to their communities of origin. So those are vulnerabilities that I just wanted to present to you a little bit more general, that migrant workers are exposed to begin with. And this is now not even taking into consideration the current situation that we have in the Gulf. This is like the starting point, right? Next slide, please. So you have risks, like we usually also classify those risks, by those risks that are faced by the migrant workers during the recruitment process versus the risks that they are facing once they arrive in the country of destination and that they are facing during employment. And as you will then see later in our next meeting, probably after the summer, we will go actually a lot more into details on what the companies in the private sector can do to mitigate those risks, both during the recruitment process, but also the risks faced by migrant workers during the employment when they are already here. But for today, I thought I would first of all provide you a bit of an overview of what are those risks, and then we can discuss in our next meeting in September in more detail what the private sector, what the companies can do to try to mitigate some of those risks. So during the recruitment process, I already mentioned some of those risks. You have very often in those communities, in these rural communities, you have what we call unlicensed agents, or unauthorized agents. And those agents are simply family members. It can be family members, it can be friends, it can be acquaintances of someone that basically comes into the village and starts talking about the opportunities for people to go to the Gulf, to work in the Gulf, and establish the first contact to an agent that sits in a city, right? And in an actual office. And these unlicensed or unauthorized agents, and we will look at all the actors that are usually part of the supply chain, they are often already the very first people that take money in different shapes and forms. But they are not providing that initial contact to that agent that can actually, help the person to look for a job offer. They are not doing that for free. So that's already where the unethical recruitment starts, because in the recruitment process, and again, many of you know, the employer pays principle applies. And that means that it should not be the migrant worker to have to pay all along the stages of the recruitment process to get to the job and to get the actual job. It should be the employer. And it is the responsibility of the employer, and that's where we talk about due diligence, to ensure that throughout the entire supply chain, going as far back as to where the people live and where they first hear about the jobs, that there is no recruitment fees that are being asked from the migrant workers. So that is one kind of agents, job opportunities outside. Now, depending on what nature the agents are that this person is then dealing with, consequently, those recruitment agencies sitting in an office, sitting in the cities, they might also provide the migrant worker with an incorrect type of visa. So that when the person arrives in the country of destination, they find out at that point that they have the wrong visa on which they arrived, which again makes them vulnerable for exploitation, because in that situation, they don't have many options. And if they don't want to basically return, then they will be forced to take on any type of job that they can for the time being, until they manage to find a way how to rectify the visa and find an employer who will then help them to get the right visa and the work permit. What also often happens is that recruitment agencies in countries of origin ask the migrant worker to sign an employment contract in the country of origin in a language that the person understands. But then the person arrives in the country of destination and they will be shown a work contract in a language that they don't understand, in Arabic, and they will be told that this is basically, the contract that they have to sign now that they are here, and no need to worry, it's the same contract, only in a different language. The problem is that they can't read the contract. And again, if you are in a situation where you already have arrived in the country of destination, you don't have really many options other than signing up to that contract and hoping for the best. But the fact is, and that's what we call contract substitution, that people don't really know what they are signing up to. During the recruitment process, we also see that, what I was talking about, that all along the way, the migrant workers will be asked by these different agents when they are being passed on from one to the other, that all of them, they extract some sort of fee from them for the information, for the visa appointment, for the actual visa, for the transportation costs, for all the costs and fees that have to be paid along the way. Maybe a new passport is necessary. So the agents will take on a lot of that work to organize this, but not for free. And that accumulates basically to, in the worst case, debt bondage, because people will have to take out loans, and those loans are often come with high interest rates, and they arrive already in the country of destination with those debts because of the loans that they had to take out to pay for the migration costs. I mentioned that these risks are, of course, increased if the migrant workers are basically left without any information. So one thing that IOM is really trying to establish, both with governments but also with employers, is pre-departure orientation and post-arrival orientation. So we do provide this type of orientation to migrant workers, for example, coming from Bangladesh, going to Jordan to work in the garment sector. And sometimes these trainings are really life-saving. There have been, unfortunately, very tragically, but there have been cases of suicide simply because people, women in that case, they arrive basically from one day to the next from a village in Jordan in the factory in the garment sector. No one has told them about the working conditions, where they will live, how they will live, how much they will work. And people within months, 2, 3 months, they become so overwhelmed with the situation and the stress and the fact that they cannot talk to anyone, that some people just don't see any other way than to basically take their lives. Now, it really is not necessary. It doesn't have to come to that. If people are provided with the proper information all along this recruitment path, and also once they arrive in the country, when they are already taking up employment, you provide them with post-arrival orientation, you clarify all these questions on what is expected from them, what can they expect, what are where are the places, where are the services where they can look for help. Yeah? And people will feel much more relaxed and can actually focus on the job that they are supposed to accomplish. We move on to the next slide, please, and we look at some of the risks faced during employment. And here you have, for example, living conditions. I think last time we also already talked about living conditions. We were actually talking more about shelter, right? If there is, as it happens now, there is an attack and people have to look for shelter. How does that shelter have to be? How does it have to look like? How does it have to be equipped? But here we are talking about living conditions for migrant workers under normal circumstances. And what are the minimum conditions for accommodation for migrant workers? The amount of square meters that every person normally should have to avoid overcrowding in rooms. We are talking about air conditioning in accommodation, especially in the Gulf now during the summer, so people can actually cool off and get rest and sleep. We are talking about wages, making sure that the wages are paid on time, regularly. A lot of governments in the Gulf have already taken measures, wage protection measures, by setting up these platforms and bank accounts where the wages are directly transferred from the employer to those bank accounts, so that is controlled by the government. So if a company, if an employer is not paying the wages, there are also fines for the employers. We are looking at access to Social Security. Now that is a little bit more tricky. In general, maybe with the exception of Oman, migrant workers do not have access to national social protection schemes in the Gulf. However, most of the governments have introduced by now insurance schemes insurance schemes for employers, for recruiters, and also for migrant workers, for health insurance, for pension. And with these kind of insurance schemes, even though they are of course private and they have to be paid for, migrant workers and their employers can ensure coverage and can ensure access to Social Security, which is important because without that, you also don't have access to health services other than emergency health services, right? Another risk that can be faced by migrant workers during employment is that the employers withhold their passports, withhold their documents, their national IDs, sometimes not even with the intention to basically control the movement of people, but simply because employers also, and even the workers, they feel that it's maybe safer if the employer keeps the identity documents. But often enough, where this is not just done out of good intentions, it leads, for example, to the situation that the employer does not renew the work permit in due time, and the worker can't do it because he doesn't have access to his own identity documents. And that leads to situations where people are then overstaying, and they become irregular. And as an irregular migrant worker, of course, an employer that is bad-willed has more power over the migrant worker, because being in an irregular situation, there is the fear for deportation. So the migrant worker will then, in that case, agree to stay with the employer, but without a work contract and basically at the mercy of the employer. That is what we all know many stories of. That was symptomatic for this kafala system. But again, I have seen that most governments have really changed this type of work contract in the meantime. All right, I'll move on a little bit faster. So if we move on, please, to the next, not only to the next slide, which is just showing basically how all of these different risk factors can lead in the worst case to the situation of forced labor. But we move on 2 more slides to also talk now about the role of companies and how they can mitigate and address risks to migrant workers in their supply chains. This is a training that we typically provide to big employers, multinationals that are active in several countries of the Gulf. We are working a lot with the private sector in the Asia Pacific on providing these kind of trainings, because you know that huge labor migration corridors lead from Asia, very well established corridors lead from Asia to the Gulf. And so we are doing this training with recruitment agencies, which are one of the key agents and actors in the supply chain. But we also do these trainings with the employers, with the the human resource teams of those big companies. Who often operate in the Gulf through franchisees. So those are typically our target group for this kind of training, what the private sector, what the companies can do to avoid that migrant workers will face all these risks that we have just discussed now in the recruitment process. You can see here again what I mentioned, that this recruitment process already starts in the country of origin, and very often it is these informal agents or brokers that operate at the community level, but it can also be training centers where the people hear the first time about these options to work in the Gulf. It can be travel agencies, it can be in the clinics that they hear about opportunities. And then the migrant workers, as they move up through the supply chain from the right to the left, they will have to do with recruitment agencies in the countries of origin. Those are the ones that would typically set up the visa appointments, that would help them to get the visa, they are the ones who would ask them to sign the first work contract, right, in the country of origin. Then we have private employment agencies in the countries of destination that work together with the recruitment agencies in the countries of origin. Again, those agencies will also take money again for the actual placement of the person with the employer. And before the people get to the employer, they usually have to deal with suppliers, the third-party suppliers or subcontractors, who hire and employ the migrant workers and actually bring them to the hotels, to the stores, to the construction sites, wherever the ultimate buyer, employer is for who these people will be working. So that's why we then talk about the responsibility of the private sector, of the employers, to ensure that across the entire supply chain, that they make sure that there are no recruitment fees for the migrant workers, and that everyone from the third-party supplier to those agents that work with the supplier or with that subcontractor, that all the way down to the country of origin and to that village where the recruitment agencies might send out these more informal agents and brokers, that throughout that supply chain, there is no fees that are being paid by the migrant workers that can lead to debt bondage. So next slide, please. We are talking about the responsibility of businesses now to basically respect the human rights and the human rights impacts, to do the due diligence that those human rights are not infringed, and to engage with the workers. And next slide, please. We can go a little bit more into detail on the next slide. So on the next slide, the first circle, that we have seen on respecting human rights and the remedy of human rights impacts. So these principles, they come from the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which I think are very well known in this circle. This document, the UN guiding principles, identify who is responsible to protect, respect, and provide remedy for human rights and businesses. It was developed about 15 years ago, and the Human Rights Council of the UN has released these guiding principles on protection, respect, and remedy for migrant workers. And the protect basically talks about the government responsibility, as governments have the first duty to protect the human rights and to protect individuals from human rights abuses, including human rights abuses by businesses. So the governments are supposed to provide that sort of protection by enacting and enforcing laws, regulating private actors, and, for example, especially the recruitment agencies. So that's also another area where IOM provides capacity building for government officials to come up with a monitoring and licensing framework for those recruitment agencies, and also ensuring access to justice. So also the governments are supposed to put in place remedies and mechanisms where migrant workers can turn to if something goes wrong and expect that the government, the Ministry of Labor, is also going after perpetrators when they violate the human rights of migrant workers. And in Kuwait, the Public Authority of Manpower has actually put in place such a mechanism through the platform that they have set up. Now, on the respect, that is the responsibility of businesses. So here we talk about the responsibility by the businesses to respect human rights, and that means avoiding to infringe on the rights of others and address the adverse impacts that they are involved in. And that has a lot to do with the due diligence that we were talking about. Apply due diligence throughout the supply chain. Know who are your third-party suppliers, know who they are dealing with, who are they doing business with, and make sure that through code, the way how they engage with you is basically guided and follows those principles, for example, the employer pays principle, to ensure fair recruitment. It also means that businesses need to abide by the protections that the governments have put in place. They need to follow the law. And one, I think, example which demonstrates clearly how governments put in place the legal framework that then basically has to be followed by the businesses is the supply chain directive that the EU has initiated. I think we have to be very honest and also recognize that the initial version of this due diligence of the supply chain directive and the due diligence that it demands from businesses that wish to do business with the EU has been quite a bit watered down. It does probably at this point not really provide that much protection because it doesn't really put in place very strict limitations for businesses. But it was definitely an effort in that direction that the EU wanted to set standards on how to conduct due diligence in supply chains for companies that wish to do business with the EU. I think that some of the due diligence that is demanded by the US is probably more strict than the supply chain directive as it is now in the EU. And lastly, the remedy, that is an area where basically the government and the businesses should work together. Governments have to ensure that the mechanisms, the judicial mechanisms are in place, and businesses are expected to establish the grievance mechanisms. And that can be at the operational level, it can be done through a third party, or it can be done in a partnership with a third party. And again, I think we will be talking a little bit more about how to respect the human rights and how to put in place remedy mechanisms in our next seminar, the one that will then happen in September after the summer. Here on this slide, I just wanted to show you the due diligence cycle that the OECD has come up with. OECD, again, bringing together 57 countries from Canada to the US to Europe. And you can see here that basically the responsible business conduct takes several shapes. It starts with identifying and assessing the adverse impacts in the operations, in the supply chains. So what we have talked about, how does the buyer interact with the third-party suppliers, with the recruitment agencies in the countries of destination, in the countries of origin? How does the private sector provide for or cooperate when it comes to remediation? How do you seize, prevent, or mitigate those adverse impacts? For example, through the introduction of these kind of internal codes and policies on ethical recruitment. on the supply side, on the retail side? How do you also track the implementation of those internal policies and codes? What are the results? So monitoring, evaluation, and then very importantly, communication, not only to the outside world, to your business partners, to your customers, to your clients, but also to the migrant workers, so that they also understand what are those internal policies, what sort of protection do they provide, and what are their rights, and therefore that they can claim, and how do these remedy mechanisms work for them, right? If you don't communicate that to the migrant workers, they will also not use it. So making that known, and making that known to everyone in the supply chain is a very important part of ethical recruitment strategy in a business. And with this, I think I pass it over to Vinny, who will talk to you about practical actions that employers can take in a situation of crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tanya. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. And
Yes.
thank you, Tanya, for covering quite a comprehensive and very broad topic, which we couldn't fully exhaust within this 1 hour. So I have about 10 minutes just to cover. If you could take us to the next slide, please, to cover a bit on looking at what are the practical actions that employers can take, and especially when we are looking at crisis situations. And to understand your role as an employer to migrant workers, especially in crisis situation, we begin by understanding why employer matters during crisis situation. And what I would pose as a question, though we won't have time to interact around it, it's what do you think is your role in protecting and reducing the vulnerabilities of the workers that work within your company? Because that then supports in understanding where do you start. So employers play a critical role, frontline, if I may say, in ensuring that migrant workers are not left behind during crisis situations. Whether it's a conflict or a natural hazard or a healthy emergency like a pandemic, we are able to highlight before migrant workers often within the previous slides, what are some of the risks they face. We've been able to highlight some of those vulnerabilities that they are likely to, experience. So having or cognizant of that, then we are able to see what are these vulnerabilities and how can we support them in ensuring that we provide protection and we reduce these vulnerabilities, whether it's language barrier, limited access to, the local networks and knowledge, the communication and the messaging that is being provided, their migration or legal status, what restrictions they have in terms of access to services and protection. So in this context, employers become a key actor who can bridge these gaps and provide essential support. And your responsibility as an employer goes beyond business continuity, and it extends to duty of care. Being able to ensure that workers' safety, dignity, and rights at all times, whether in normal circumstances as well as during crisis situations. So we are guided, this diagram that we have on the slide, it's guided by the MIKIC initiative guidelines, which we were able to cover a bit of it in the last session, the session 1 that we did. And MIKIC in full is Migrants in Countries in Crisis Initiative Guideline that emphasizes that employers are well positioned to provide information, resources, and coordination that can directly influence whether migrant workers are adequately protected. So being able to embed preparedness measures, ensuring effective emergency response, supporting recovery of migrant workers, employers help reduce that inequality. Also, employers are able to benefit from safeguarding their workforce because you ensure quicker recovery of operations, you're able to maintain robust supply chains, as well as an employer, engaging with other humanitarian actors and the government authority becomes imperative. But also it's a way to strategically ensure that you understand what's happening, you understand what's being put in place, and the mechanisms that you can be able to align yourself into. So across the phases of the crisis, because that's what the Make It guidelines guides us on, and what this diagram actually shows, it's being able to ensure that there is that migrant inclusivity in crisis response. So looking at preparedness phase, which is the planning, inclusion, and risk reduction, employers are expected to undertake proactive actions that reduce migrant workers' vulnerability before even a crisis occurs. And it's being able to have an analysis of what are the high risk hazards within the environment that you're working in, whether within the borders or outside the borders. What is that likely to affect the usual business, operations? And then what does that then mean? And within that, when you're developing your business continuity plan, there's also in place an inclusive contingency plan. And that comprehensive contingency plan and business continuity plan, it's able to explicitly include migrant workers and address their specific risks, such as isolation, language barrier, migration status. And employers should maintain that accurate, up-to-date records for their migrant employees, including their contact details, their location of residence, to be able to enable that rapid communication during emergencies. And further to this, it is essential also to ensure that all workers receive accessible information through multilingual communication. And you're only able to know this when you understand your migrant workers, their origin, what languages they understand best, without assumption that all of them are able to understand the language within the country that is widely spoken or that is widely used as a channel for communication. Then being able to understand that, you're able to tailor the communication and the messaging that is already existing to be able to ensure that there is that effective communication. Also being able to cover emergency procedures, rights, and available assistance. So employers should also be able to conduct what I would say regular training sessions and simulation exercises. So workers understand the evacuation processes in the event that they would be needed. They understand safe behaviors. They understand who they would contact, who they can coordinate with, how they could be able to access any support network, as well as being able to have that financial preparedness, which is also another critical impact. So the other aspect is being able to look at collaboration and coordination with existing coordination mechanisms in the country, being able to understand how do you participate in coordination platforms with authorities, with the embassies, with other humanitarian organizations or actors that are present in the country, and industry associations to be able to harmonize crisis planning efforts. Then this collaborative action ensures that preparedness measures are inclusive, comprehensive, and they are capable of addressing the complex needs of migrant populations while strengthening overall crisis resilience. Then looking at the next, which is now during a crisis, what we call the protection, the communication, and evacuation. Its employers must act swiftly to protect their employees. Thereby, you're able to ensure that there's access to life-saving information and services. There's that clear and real-time communication, which is a top priority, especially during a crisis situation, where you're required to provide up-to-date information in languages that migrants are able to understand, and also understanding prior the risks and any evacuation routes and any available resources through the coordination mechanism that you can be able to communicate to your employees. Then this entails also maintaining emergency hotlines or focal point persons that ensure that workers can seek assistance quickly, or they can be able to seek guidance on where to access information and assistance as quickly as possible. Also, employers should guarantee non-discriminatory access to basic services such as shelter, food, water, healthcare, any psychosocial support, to be able to ensure that workers are able to access that just like any other person, regardless of their nationality, their legal status, or their level of employment. Also, when we look at financial support mechanism, including continued wages, emergency plan payments, which then can be able to help workers meet immediate needs when normal income streams are disrupted. The other dynamics is looking at evacuation. Should it become a necessity, especially outside the country, then employees are able to play a key role in facilitating safe movement by organizing transportation, coordinating evacuation efforts, and collaborating with, embassies and consulate offices, the public authority, to be able to advocate and negotiate. Also, employers must ensure that no worker is left behind, especially when we look at whether the worker is subcontracted as a casual laborer or others are located in isolated remote locations. All of them are included in this planning and in the response. Looking at the next, which is the recovery. This is usually, we call it the post-crisis phase, where we look at recovery and system strengthening. As an employer, you have a key responsibility again to support migrant workers in rebuilding their lives and restoring livelihoods. One of the first steps to facilitate a safe return to work is ensuring that you will still have their contact outside the country, that you're able to communicate with them even when they're out of the country, to be able to let them know that when it's safe to return, then they can be able to be facilitated to return, as well as ensuring that working conditions meet the health and safety standards. Also, you're able to provide access to health services, including psychosocial support where it's needed, and especially when you have migrant workers who have experienced trauma situations. Also, to be able to address, any situations that they might have experienced during the crisis, as well as resolving any financial matters. Financial resolution and reintegration becomes key because there's the need to look at whether there's need to pay any unpaid wages or compensation claims, as well as looking at any essential for, restoring workers to financial stability and trust. So for migrants who cannot remain in the host countries, employers can assist in voluntary return processes or connect workers with reintegration, programs in their country of origin. But if they are able to return, then you're able to support them to return back and support their skill development and offering re-employment opportunities to help the workers regain economic independence. Important also being able to, having looked at the different phases of the crisis, and especially when the crisis situation now has, basically, rescinded and you're in the post-crisis, you also want to try and do what we conduct, which is called the after-action review, where you allow employers and employees to come together and identify gaps and where they could be able to improve their future preparedness and response strategy. So by institutionalizing the lesson learned through the after action review, you're able to strengthen that resilience of how you would be able then to respond in an event that is a reoccurrence of another crisis. So in the next slide, so all across all the phases of the crisis, several cross-cutting principles. Kindly, let's go to the next slide. Able to guide employers' actions in protecting migrant workers. The principle of duty of care requires employers to prioritize the safety, dignity, and fundamental rights of all workers, regardless of their status. Non-discrimination is essential also to ensure equal access to assistance and services, eliminating barriers based on nationality, language, and legal situation. Also, effective and inclusive communication. It's critical at every stage, allowing migrant workers to understand risk and access support services without confusion, as well as continued coordination. And I can't emphasize this more, but there's the need to ensure that there is that collaborative coordination, working closely with the government, international organization, embassies, and civil society actors to ensure inclusive coordination and response. Another key principle is recognizing migrants as active contributors to crisis management, encouraging their participation in preparedness planning, in response action, in the recovery efforts. That way, you're able to ensure that the response you provide is effective, the preparedness that you put in place is adequate, as well as the recovery efforts are aligned to the gaps that exist. And as well as embedding these principles into policies and practices, employers can create a more resilient and inclusive workforce. So the overall takeaway is to be able to ensure that proactive planning before crisis, decisive action during emergencies, and sustained support after crisis are all necessary to prevent migrant workers from being left behind or from their vulnerability increasing further, which would then exacerbate them to probably negative coping mechanisms, which then is not a requirement that we would want to look at. So having said that, overall, we are able to support you through, especially when we are looking at development of contingency planning, looking at some of the standard operating procedures that you can be able to develop, coming up with a training package as well as simulation exercises that can be able to be tested and support in addressing the gaps that would then be identified. So in a nutshell, that's within the time that I had. I know we have gone quite ahead with 3 minutes, but that's what I would practically look at and supports you in just advocating that within the planning systems that you already have in place, see how then you can be able to expand them further, review and redevelop to ensure that they are inclusive, to ensure that they look at what actions you can be able to place even at this preparedness stage, reflecting back on the crisis situation that we recently had that affected the country. How then would you be able to improve? What were some of the lessons learned that you draw from to be able to basically improve the systems and the policies and the strategies that you already have in place? So thank you so much. Unless there is any question, maybe we can take 1 or 2 before we can close, if that is all right.
Thank you so much, Winnie. So I think one of the main one that I believe it's relevant to a lot of the entities joining today is this slide, the bottom part. So a lot of it would incur costs on entities, yes? Are there any, like when it comes to psychosocial support, right? Is there any program that the IOM has at this time that they could potentially share with entities where they can share this with their employees about addressing trauma, PTSD, etc.?
All right. I don't know whether at country level, but there could be actors that are within the country that would be able to provide that. And that's why collaborative coordination becomes important, because with all those actors on the table, we are able to understand what capacities each of these actors has and how they would be able to support in the event that the capacities that they have would be required. For instance, you're asking about psychosocial support. Probably from IOM side at country level, we do not have that support or that capacity at the present, but there is a possibility that within the coordination network, that there would be presence of an actor that provides that service. So then aligning with that actor becomes critical, and especially when we are looking at crises, during the crisis and at the recovery stage. Also to say that not all of these interventions, practical actions actually are financial driven. For example, when we are looking at developing a contingency plan, or being able to ensure that, there is in place standard operating procedures for how we communicate and we ensure effective communication, you're able to do it probably also in-house without necessarily requiring extra financial resources to support that, where you're able to bring in different key stakeholders to come together and be able to develop a contingency plan as well as the business continuity plan.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And Tatiana has her hand raised.
Right. So just maybe complementing. So Vinny is, I think, mostly focusing really on the immediate crisis response and contingency planning. Those issues when it comes to recovery and system strengthening is maybe more with the colleagues, that work on labor mobility and on social inclusion. As a matter of fact, IOM has provided training and psychosocial support in Bahrain. And I think also in Kuwait, we have done a training with the communities, with the migrant associations. So I think as a business, I would advise you, and there I concur with Vinny, that you can best do through coordination. So if you are not sure where you can send your migrant workers to get some health and some MHPSS, probably IOM is a good point to contact to find out where and who does provide this sort of training. We as IOM do as well, but there's of course a lot more out there, especially available from migrant associations. On financial resolution, reintegration, skills development to basically help people to get back on their feet and return to their countries of origin, work on reintegration, or to work on skills development, upskilling, economic recovery because they have lost their jobs, they need to shift to another sector, to another profession altogether. This is probably and typically not done and stamped only by private sector. This is where IOM comes in and basically helps to form public-private partnerships, because those kind of efforts are best done also in collaboration with the government in the country of destination, but even with the country of origin, no? When we think about return, reintegration, and how to support people in getting back on their feet in the country of origin. And that is where IOM and the fact that IOM has missions everywhere across the globe, where IOM can effectively bring together the governments and try to help to form these partnerships, including the private sector. So not to worry that these type of measures or interventions are expected to be 100% and fully and only be paid by the private sector. That calls for larger partnerships also with the governments involved.
Thank you, Tanya. And Dr. Stacy's asking, is a migrant worker an unskilled laborer? What's the definition and who is included?
No, a migrant worker is not only and necessarily an unskilled worker. That is maybe what you see for the most part in the Gulf. But no, migrant workers are also those who work in finance, those who work in engineering companies, those who work in hotels, those who work as consultants. They are also migrant workers. They all work on migrant visa, especially in the Gulf. So migrant workers you can be found at any skill level, if that was the question of the gentleman.
Yes, I believe so. So yeah, Dr. Stacy, I believe this is what Tanya is saying, is workers who are not in their home country are migrant workers. So that could be a CEO as well, who could be considered a migrant worker. Yes, Tanya?
Yeah, because basically anyone in the GCC needs a visa to be able to work in the Dubai or to work in Riyadh or in Kuwait. So all of us, including us as civil servants, we are also not working in our countries of origin. We also have a visa, in our case from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In other cases, it's the immigration authority that issues the work permits, the residence permits. So from that point of view, we are all migrant workers.
Thank you so much for this wonderful session. And I know we went a little bit over time, but I think it was very insightful. So we hope that today's session has provided all of our participants with practical insights that you can take back to your organizations and hopefully incorporate them into your policies and practices. And hopefully we will do the third session in September. We will coordinate on that and then send a message out to everybody. Again, thank you so much for your participation and engagement, and thank you to both speakers. We look forward to welcome you to future initiatives and continuing this very important conversation with our partners. Have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you all for joining us.
And thank you very much for inviting us again, Paula. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Paula.
Thank you, Tanya and Winnie. Take care of yourselves.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.